Dan Rather, you may have heard this story, one time interviewed Mother Teresa. And his question, if you're going to ask Mother Teresa anything, what do you ask her? And so he asked her, when you pray, what do you say to God? What's your prayer life like? And I kind of really wanted to know the answer to that question. What does Mother Teresa pray for? World peace? Like Calcutta? Does she pray for her city? Does she pray for the salvation of a nephew? What does she pray for? I want to know. Like, Mother Teresa, teach me how to pray. And do you remember her answer? Have you heard this story? I don't say anything. I listen. Dan Rather's kind of taken aback. Well, what does God say to you then? What does God say? If you're listening to God, what does he say to you? And her response? He doesn't say anything. He listens. And at first you hear that, first time I heard that, my immediate reaction was, wow, that's profound and beautiful. Thank you, Mother Teresa, very helpful. But then it really is kind of beautiful, this picture of Mother Teresa and God in this kind of dance of prayer where they listen to each other. They're actually listening to each other. What would that look like? And I was really attracted to this picture. But then the second thought that hit me was, I don't really even know what that means. Like, what does it even mean that you sit with God and listen to each other? I don't even know. And she even says to Dan Rather, if you don't know what that means, I can't tell you. I'm like, thanks so much. Helpful again. Great. But then I had this third thought that hit me. Anytime we talk about prayer and spiritual disciplines, especially with people like Mother Teresa, you just kind of go, that's Mother Teresa. Like, I'm out. That's like she's waiting for an empty space in the Trinity. There's nothing I can do there. I'm not going to be, I never will be, I can't even try to be Mother Teresa. Mother Teresa, you just go on and be Mother Teresa, and I'm just going to be Jonathan and suck at prayer, to be honest. Like, I'm just out. I think we use that, it's the Mother Teresa cop-out. Let's just call it what it is. It's Mother Teresa, but here's the thing. Prayer is hard. Let's just go ahead and get it out there. It is. It's very difficult. And especially what we're talking about tonight, listening prayer. Listening prayer is very hard. That's why we're spending 2 weeks talking about prayer in this whole rhythms journey. It's very, very difficult. And I think we hate this, but we need this. We got to have this. In our busy, chaotic, crazy, hectic world that screams at us constantly, and in your busy, chaotic, hectic mind, your mental, emotional, spiritual life, we need this practice of listening prayer. And the good news is you can do it. You don't have to be of the spiritual caliber of Mother Teresa to be able to enter into this practice and be able to try it, to be able to do it, to be able to work at it. Everyone, if I can do this, I've come back from these times of listening prayer, and if I can do it, you can do it. You really can. Even C.S. Lewis, and there's a quote in your bulletin. I'm not going to draw it out. I want you to spend time looking at it. But he just says, let's come clean. Prayer is difficult. If you're discouraged about your prayer life, take a look at that quote. I think it's the first quote in your bulletin from C.S. Lewis, because he just admits prayer is hard. You think about C.S. Lewis, spiritual giant. What did he do all day? He sat around with a pipe in his mouth, and he was spiritual. He thought spiritual thoughts. He wrote spiritual things. He prayed spiritual prayers. If C.S. Lewis says, he said, there's no adjective to describe how poor my spiritual life is. He may be discouraged, but that gives me hope. I'm serious. If C.S. Lewis has a hard time with this, we're in good company. Okay, let's just say that. I think our other pushbacks to this whole idea of listening prayer, it seems so mysterious, mystical, esoteric. And many of us are just normal people. We're just normal, everyday, hardworking people. This room is filled with normal dudes. And as we talk about meditation, contemplation, it just seems so out there, so otherworldly. A lot of evangelicals have a problem when we talk about listening prayer, when we talk about listening to God, when we talk about meditation, because you're worried it's going to kind of ease over into this zone of like Eastern meditation from Hinduism and Buddhism. You're kind of worried about that. But the biggest thing that keeps us from this listening prayer, this contemplation, this meditative type of prayer is really the pace of our lives and the pace of our hearts, the pace of our minds. We just don't know what it means to slow down anymore. That's why it's perfect that this sermon comes right after Sabbath, because we've got to, instead of, please hear me, as we talk about prayer, Bible reading, community, living in community, as we talk about these things for the next few weeks, we're not trying to get you to load more stuff on your plate. Do you hear me? We're not trying to fill your schedule with more so that you can be even more pressed to the margins and even more filled with anxiety. The struggle for you is going to be, what can I remove from my plate? What can I take? What am I busy with? What am I anxious about? What am I running around doing that's not necessary? How can I simplify my life? How can I boil it down to its core essences? How can I pull stuff out of my calendar so I can make room for God? Right? That's what we're asking you to do with this whole rhythms journey. How can you pull stuff out of your life so you can make room for God? So as you're listening to us teach this for the next few weeks, think about that. What needs to go in your life? What is just producing busyness and anxiety that doesn't need to be there? That's a great question. That's a great question. As we go into listening prayer, you need to know that there are several ways that God speaks. The first one is the Bible. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time on this tonight because we're going to devote a whole week to what it means to read, study, and hear God speak through your Bible. God has given us His Word, His written Word, and we believe that God speaks to us through that, in that. That's why we study the Bible. That's why we preach the Bible. That's why we study the Bible in community. And that's why you need to be comfortable studying, reading, and meditating on your Bible. But we're going to spend a whole week on that. So the Bible is one of the primary, if not the primary ways that God speaks to His people. The second one is through the church community. That one's so important as well. We're going to spend an entire week on that. Through the church community. God speaks through the local church. That's why it's so vital for you to be involved in a community group. That's why it's vital for you to make sure that you are surrounded with brothers and sisters that you can be honest and real with and not just play this fake smiley church game with. God speaks through community. But the second two are the ones that we're going to focus on tonight. God speaks through prayer, through this listening, meditative, quiet prayer. We're going to look at that in a few minutes. And then there's a fourth category, a special little category. It's a theological term I call everything. God just speaks through everything. He's real. And I really believe, not as a pastor, but just as a child of God, that God is real and alive, that He's omnipresent, that He's everywhere, that God is not just confined to this room or to your heart or everything you invited Him into, but God is everywhere. And He's trying to press in even now through your entire day, and He's trying to speak. And we live in this cloud. There's just this wall of stuff that presses in on us endlessly, of noise and endless sound bites and 30-second commercials and more technology and conversations and confusions. And if we could just take a knife, like a scalpel, and just slit it open, we would see this reality behind it all where God is. And He's trying to press in and communicate to your heart even now. He is alive and He is real and He's present. And if you and I could just wake up, we would see the reality of God. C.S. Lewis says it better than I do. We may ignore, but we can nowhere evade the presence of God. I think he's meditating here on Psalm 139. We can ignore, but we can nowhere evade the presence of God. The world is crowded with Him. I love that language. The world is crowded with Him. He walks everywhere incognito, meaning kind of unseen. He walks everywhere incognito, and the incognito is not always easy to penetrate. The real labor is to remember to attend, in fact, to come awake, still more to remain awake. This is that wake-up call. Wake up. God is here. And He's not just here. He's there tomorrow and the next day. And where have you missed him speaking? God is trying to communicate to you through your circumstances, and where have you missed it? Where have you been such in a fuzzy cloud of your own distractedness, of your own fear, worry, anxiety, that you've missed God trying to communicate to you through your circumstances? And where and how is God trying to communicate? Through the soft caress of someone you love. Through a kiss. Through a beautiful sunset. Through sometimes painful things. Through the burn of your abs when you're working out at the gym. Seriously. Through the strain of a beautiful piece of music. Through a hard trial or circumstance. Through something in the middle of your day that just throws you off, and you're forced in this moment to either freak out or cling to Him. Where in your day, in the normal circumstances of your day, is God trying to communicate? Has He been whispering all the days of your life and you've just been blind to it? And what is He trying to say? I'm here. I'm here. I'm with you. I will never leave you or forsake you. You're not alone. Don't forget me. I want to be present with you throughout your day. Where has He given you time after time, moment after moment, opportunity after opportunity to worship? I mean, this up here tonight is fantastic. God's presence is felt and sensed, and we worship. But how many times during a day have you missed moments like that because you're blind? God not only is trying to communicate to you through your circumstances, but He's also trying to convict you, I think, sometimes through your conscience. I mean, Christians and non-Christians alike know that little twinge right before you send that reply all email that you typed up really quickly and angrily, like that little twinge that says, maybe you shouldn't send that yet. Listen to that. Listen to that. God speaks, He's given you a conscience, and He's oftentimes trying to convict you through that. And a lot of times, if you're hasty, God's trying to tell you to slow down for a second. Before you hit reply all, maybe think through that. Before you say that thing that you really know is going to hurt your spouse, but you want to say it anyway because it just feels so right. Before you start that argument, before you cut that person open, stop for a minute. Stop. God's oftentimes trying to convict you through your conscience. Some people in this room, you know there's someone that you're supposed to call. You're supposed to call and say, I'm sorry. God's been trying to convict you through your conscience. There's somebody you're supposed to apologize to, somebody that you're supposed to call up, somebody that you're supposed to make amends with. You know it, and you've just been trying to push it off because it seems too difficult. I don't want anything to do with that. God's trying to communicate to you through your circumstances. God's trying to convict you through your conscience. And the thing is, we can act like we're Christians in this room. We love God, we believe in God, but during the day, many of you are functional atheists. Theologically, yeah, there's a God, He exists, but you live your life like a functional atheist, like it's you doing your deal by yourself, and God says basically, good luck to you at the beginning of each day. Hope you figure it out okay. If you really believe that He was alive and real and present, where in your day would you hear Him speak? Would you turn to Him? Would your life be filled with wonder and worship? That's the Christian life I'm trying to call you to. God is here and alive. God is speaking through your circumstances. God is speaking through everything. I think this is encouragement, though. And this helps us in prayer. It helps us in listening prayer because if you really saw this, that God is real and alive and He's trying to communicate to you, He's trying to speak to you, then I think this would make prayer easier because we would go to prayer and not think that God was hidden or veiled like sometimes He feels. Sometimes we go to prayer and it feels like God is hidden, that there's a Grand Canyon between us and God, that he's speaking to everyone else but us, or he's speaking only to the Mother Teresas of the world and not to us. But when you begin to see that the world is crammed with God, that he walks everywhere incognito, when you begin to see that he's alive and he's speaking, this is an encouragement to prayer, because if you and I could just still ourselves for a second, we might hear him speak, because he wants to speak. He's not trying to hide from you. He's not trying to stay hidden from you. He's not trying to stay veiled. God wants to speak. In fact, he's been trying to speak to you your entire life. And if you and I could just hush for a minute, we might hear him. I think this is an encouragement to prayer. So as we look at listening prayer, and there's definitely a need to silence, still, quiet our minds, quiet our hearts, quiet our environment, and listen to God, because he's out there and he's speaking. As we look at this idea of listening prayer, I want us to look at 3 stories from the Bible. As we look at these 3 stories from the Bible, we're going to get a clue from each one, like we're putting together this puzzle. We're going to get a clue from each one on how to do listening prayer and what's the key of listening prayer. How do we listen to God? And the first story, you don't have to turn there. I'm just going to tell it to you. If you grew up in Sunday school, you know some of these stories. The first story comes from 1 Kings 19, and it's the story of one of God's prophets, Elijah. And he'd just come from a major win. He had won a battle against some of these false prophets, the false prophets of Jezebel, right? But she had what? She was out to kill him, right? If you remember that, you remember the story? Jezebel is out to kill Elijah, and so he just won this major victory, but he's tired and he's exhausted, and so he goes into the wilderness to meet God, because he just needs to meet with God, and he goes to the mountain of God, and he goes and hides inside a cave, and God says, "You want to meet with me? Well, I'm coming. Get ready." And then there's a giant storm that rips the mountain up to shreds, but God's not in the storm. And then there's an earthquake, but God's not in the earthquake. And then there's a fire, but God's not in the fire. And then comes that small whisper, a still small voice. Literally in the Hebrew, a thin silence. There's this thin silence, this quiet moment, and God is there, not in the storm, not in the earthquake, not in the fire. God is speaking to Elijah in the thin silence. As we look at this story of Elijah meeting with God, I think we learn a few things. Number one, we learn that we have to run to God after these exhausting times of activity. We need to run to God to replenish ourselves, to hear from him again before we launch back out into more activity. But I think the real key comes from the story of Elijah, that God is calling us to quiet ourselves and listen, because oftentimes he speaks in this thin silence, this still smallness. And this calls a lot of times, and we hate this calls for solitude on our part, and it calls for the disciplines of silence. It calls for the discipline of solitude and silence, to get alone and to get away from noise and to turn off the television, to turn off music, and we hate this. Now, how many of you, I don't want to see a raise of hands, but how many of you, as soon as you walk in the door to your house or apartment, the very first thing you do is turn on the television? The other half of you, most likely, just leave the television going when you leave the house. I know my in-laws, they have 3 televisions, and all 3 of them are going all day long, even when they're gone. All 3 televisions are going. It's just to keep somebody in the house almost. Like, I don't want to walk into my apartment alone and it's dark and it's quiet, because then I might have to come in contact with God. I don't know. I might have to. I mean, why do we hate this idea of stillness, of silence, and solitude? What scares us to death about that? So we got this picture of Elijah meeting with God in the thin silence, the still small voice, the quiet whisper. Are you attuned to the quiet whisper? The next story is one that Darren hit a couple weeks ago, and it's the story of 2 sisters. And we see their stories juxtaposed against each other, and they come in contact with Jesus, and their names are Mary and Martha. And Martha, we know, pretty much all we know about Martha from this story is that she was distracted with much serving. That's exactly what the sentence says in the Bible. She was distracted with much serving. And we see that positioned against the picture of Martha, the one distracted with much serving. We see the picture instead of Mary. And what is she doing? She simply sat at the Lord's feet and listened to his teaching. So we've got two sisters. One over here, distracted with muchness and manyness, the way Richard Foster says. And then we've got Mary, who just simply sits and listens to the Lord's teaching. So we've got two sisters, two stories here, and Jesus is interacting with both. And you know, Jesus comes to Martha in the middle of her distractedness, in the middle of her working, in the middle of her serving. And Martha's irritated and she's anxious because her sister's just sitting there listening to Jesus, and Jesus doesn't seem to notice that Martha's doing all this stuff for Jesus, preparing this meal, cleaning the house, doing ministry, doing Mission St. Louis, leading a community group, teaching, working, answering emails. Jesus, don't you see that I've crammed my day with stuff for you? And Jesus approaches her and says, Martha, Martha. And the duplication of the name there means deep, heartfelt connection. He's reaching out to her. I think he loves her. And he says, Martha, Martha, you are anxious and troubled about many things, but one thing is necessary. One thing is necessary. Mary has chosen the good portion, which will not be taken away from her. You are anxious and troubled. Even there in that moment, we see that Jesus is concerned about anxiety, and he's concerned about the source of anxiety. And many of us live in this world filled with stress, fear, worry, and anxiety. And you're getting ulcers because of it. You're getting like adult acne. Your face hasn't looked this bad since high school because you just can't stop worrying. You're filled with worry, stress, and anxiety, and Jesus has an answer for it. So we've got Martha over here, distracted with much. You're anxious, he says. And then you've got Mary, and her posture is simply one who sits and listens to the words of Jesus. God's calling you away from the busyness, from the stress, the anxiety, the distractedness. He's calling you to put it down and to take a moment for the one thing that can't be taken from you. Everything that you do, everything that you build, gain, or earn, one day will be taken from you. And Jesus says, Mary has invested her time in the one thing that cannot be taken from her, me. Mary sits and listens to me. So what do you need to take off your plate? What do you ruthlessly need to cut out of your life? What activity is just not bringing the joy or the emotional or spiritual investment that you thought it was that you just need to be ruthless with? Be ruthless with your schedule. Jesus is calling you away. For Elijah, it was after great stressful activity, he needed to run to God. But the picture of Mary and Martha is even harder because it's in the middle of activity that God's saying, stop it! Put it down. Invest your life, your time, your mind, your heart in the one thing that can't be taken from you, me. Here's the thing with Elijah, with Mary and Martha, the purpose of listening prayer is relationship. The purpose of listening prayer is not just to slow down and center yourself. The purpose of listening prayer is to be more connected to Jesus. And for those of you that are worried about this kind of meditative prayer being similar to Eastern meditation, there are some similarities on the outside. But the big difference between Christian meditation and Eastern meditation is relationship. It's a greater call to attachment. Eastern meditation is a call to detachment, to detach yourself from stuff. And that's good, but not to detach yourself from everything. The Christian call to meditation is to detach yourself from stuff and anxiety and fear so that you can greater attach yourself to God. It's always a call to relationship, to greater relationship. We don't just sit and listen. We sit and listen at the feet of Jesus because he wants to know us and to be known by us. So we've got Elijah, we've got Mary and Martha. The third picture is Jesus himself. Turn in your Bible. Matthew 3 and 4 is the passage we just read. In Matthew chapter 4, we see Jesus starting off his ministry. Before he's done anything, he's led by the Spirit into the wilderness. And he's in this time of fasting. And there he's tempted by Satan. It's kind of a popular story. Jesus, before he begins his ministry, there's this crossroads where Satan offers him everything. Before you go do this thing, before you choose this Messiah track, you sure that's what you want to do? Because over here, I've got everything, like the world and all these empires and everything that you could possibly want. I've got everything over here. Just take a look at this. Right? Crucial in the life and ministry of Jesus of Nazareth. Crucial moment. And I believe he had strength and power in this moment to say no with authority to Satan because of what happened right before it. What happened right before he entered into the desert? The end of chapter 3, it's the baptism of Jesus. He goes to Galilee, to the Jordan River. John then baptizes him. And in verse 16 we see, look at 3:16. When Jesus was baptized, immediately he went up from the water, and behold, the heavens were opened to him. And he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and coming to rest on him. And behold, there was a voice. And what does the voice from heaven say? This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Now here's the key. What had Jesus done yet? Nothing. Before you go do anything, before you go heal anybody, before you go changing some water into wine, before you go, resurrecting, before you do any of that stuff, know this and know it loudly and clearly. You are my beloved Son in whom I'm well pleased, and you're not loved because you've done stuff. You're loved because you're my son. That's my boy, God says out loud. That's my boy, and I'm pleased with him. Before he's done anything, I'm pleased with him. Now, it's absolutely no accident that when we fast forward to chapter 4, the very next scene of Jesus' life, how is Satan tempting him? Verse 3, if you really are the Son of God. Verse 6, if you really are the Son of God. So God the Father says to Jesus, you're the Son. I love you. You're my beloved. And then immediately Satan says, really? Really? Because if you are the Son, then prove it to me. Change these stones into bread. Prove it to me. He counters him at the exact place where God has spoken. And you need to know this. Before you go out into your day, Monday morning, there's going to be a voice that comes to you. It's not just if you're not listening to the voice of God, you're dumb and deaf and mute, you can't hear anything. It's if you're not listening to the voice of God, you're going to hear another voice. And that voice is going to say, prove it. Prove it. And that voice is going to tempt you to live and work and do emails and to do sales calls and meetings and father and mother your kids and interact with people and do ministry out of a desire to prove it. I'll show you what I've got. Prove it. It's the voice that says, prove it. And that's the voice that will lead you into deception and run you ragged and lead you into more fear, anxiety, frustration, worry. Many of you are living your lives out of I'll prove it. I'll prove it to you. I'll show you. And God's saying, no, you've forgotten. You're my son. You're my daughter. And if you could just hear me speak that over your life, how that would radically transform your life, how that would give you fresh power, energy, excitement, and joy to do everything that I've called you to do. And you'll be able to stand up and say no to meaningless, endless activity. You'll be able to step back off the rat race, out of that performance trap where I've got to prove to everyone by my job and my paycheck and how many girls I bet on the weekend. I'll be able to stop. I'll be able to stop trying to prove who I am because I'll know who I am. I am a son, I am a daughter of the Most High King. I'm his beloved before I've done anything. Do you hear that voice? That is the heart of listening prayer. If you and I could hear that voice on a regular basis, it would absolutely release you. It would free you. Listen to this from prayer guru Richard Foster. He says, "Oh, the liberty that is released in our hearts when we let go of the opinions of others. The less we are mesmerized by human voices, the more we are able to hear the divine voice. The less we are manipulated by the expectations of others, the more we are open to the expectations of God." And I think vice versa. The more we are in tune to the divine voice, the more we have a sense of divine guidance to our lives, we're able to let go. I don't need that. I don't need that applause of men. I don't need to make that decision. I don't need to be on the inner circle there. I don't need to have that power. I'm free to serve. I'm free to be who God's called me to be because I hear the divine voice. It'll bring a sense of humility and yet confidence. You will know who you are. And you won't have to depend on other people to tell you who you are. That's the voice. God's calling you to stop for a minute, to quiet yourself, to listen to him speak, to listen to him proclaim over your heart and over your life, "This is my beloved son, this is my beloved daughter, in whom I'm well pleased." That's the lecture, like we do every week. Now let's talk lab work. What does this look like? How do you actually do this? Because if I just left you there, you'd go, "Wow, I'm fired up, but I don't know how to do it. I'm not Mother Teresa. I don't have this practice of listening prayer." So let's take some of the principles that we looked at with Elijah, Mary and Martha, and Jesus, and spend just the next few minutes looking at what that looks like in your day. Practically, like we saw with Elijah, it does mean some form in your life of silence and solitude. Now, God absolutely speaks in worship music. When you're here in a crowd, God was speaking. Now, some of you, when you're jogging, not only are you kind of wired with the worship pathway that we looked at a couple weeks ago, but you also got the nature pathway. So if you get outside, you put on your iPod buds and you're jogging, oftentimes God speaks through that. He speaks to you in the middle of activity. He speaks to you when you're working. He speaks to you when you study. But in the middle of that, you absolutely, and it doesn't necessarily have to be every single day, but there has to be regular carved out times of silence and solitude. So you've got to find a specific place. You have to find a specific place where you can be by yourself, a specific room, maybe a specific chair. As you come back to a specific place to pray, maybe it's a specific place outside, a little grove that you can walk to kind of out behind your house. I don't know what it is. I don't care if it's the bathroom. You find a specific place. As you get away to a specific place, theologians notice something. Or these guys who write about prayer a good bit notice something. As you come back to a specific place, and you've developed over the months and over the years this thing where God speaks to you in this specific place, it's almost like that ground becomes holy, that little place. And it could be your bedroom. It could be that one chair that looks out your back window. It could be a closet. That place becomes holy, sacred in a way, because you've built a history of God speaking to you in that place. So find some place. It's got to be a specific place. Whatever it helps, the very first time you do this, you're going to be distracted. So, get coffee or hot tea or something. If you're a sensate, if you like the senses, if your mind comes alive through art and music and beauty, light a candle, whatever it takes. Music, for some of you, silence is going to be very hard at first. And so just maybe put on some worship music, the Lord of the Rings soundtrack, Zamfir and his pan flute, whatever, I don't know what rings your bell. But just, a little bit of music. So there you've got your place. You've got your chair. If you've got to, you've got your candle lit. You've got whatever. But you're trying to set up this atmosphere where you'll be relaxed and you can kind of simmer down, drain away worry and anxiety, and hear from God. So you set up your place. One warning for you atmosphere nerds that are totally into this. You've got the journal with the cross stamp on it, makes you feel like a monk. Sometimes atmosphere geeks, we spend too much time on the atmosphere and not enough time actually going, you can be in your room in the dark. God will speak to you. So don't get so concerned. Pastor Jonathan said I got to light a candle and get the music before I can pray. Do what helps you. Know yourself. That's why we started with this whole thing with the pathways. So you got your place. You got your time. Make sure you got to set aside time. It doesn't have to be the exact same time each day, but set aside a specific time. This is your time. And it doesn't have to be in the morning. If you're not a morning person, if you want to kill everyone around you, God's not going to want to talk to you. God doesn't like you when you're grumpy. Come on. It doesn't have to be. Some of you, it needs to be in the morning because before you go hit the rat race, you got to hear from Jesus. But for some of you, it doesn't need to be in the morning. No one wants to see you in the morning. So find that time, whatever that time is. So you got your time, you got your place. Take more time than you need. Here's a little key that's helped me. Let's say you set a goal for the first few weeks that you're going to pray for 5 minutes or 10 minutes. 10 minutes. We'll set aside 30 minutes so that just that you know that you've got the time. So that you're not, because the biggest thing that's going to hit you are all these thoughts, worries, concerns, and anxieties, right? Set aside the time so that you're not thinking about the thing that you've got to do immediately next, that next meeting that you've got to go to, those 400 emails that you've got to answer, that whatever it is. This thing is going to take longer than you want because your mind is so filled with worry, fear, and anxiety that it's going to take, you're not just going to be able to sit down in a chair and go, all right, let's pray. And just you've got to unplug a little bit. In our world where you get frustrated, where you want to throw an anger fit just because your internet browser takes an extra half a second to load up, this thing is not going to happen like that. There's got to be time set aside where you're just going to be comfortable with the quiet, with the aloneness. You're got to be comfortable with that, and you got to wait. It's going to seem like, and I remember the very first time I really tried this, I was actually in my car. And for some of you, a car is going to be the best place. There's a friend of mine who he leaves the house 30 minutes early, gets to work 30 minutes early, and sits and meditates in his car before he goes into work. I said, I'm going to sit and do this for 10 minutes. And I closed my eyes, and it felt like 15, and I opened my eye, and it had only been 3. It's like, I'm screwed. How do I do this? This is going to take longer than you want it to, longer than you think is necessary. And you're not just going to go, all right, let's do it. And then God's going to go, you're my son. This is exactly the moment. It's not just like this loud, audible voice that's going to, you got to wait. Because at first your mind is dogged with thoughts and all this stuff. And so you need to center, to simmer down, to settle yourself, to hear yourself breathe. A lot of the people that practice this kind of prayer, they recommend something called breath prayers, where it's just this one kind of repeated prayer that you pray. For me, it's helpful just to say Abba. Abba is Father, except more intimate, like Daddy. Just to say that, it reminds me that God is here and that He's my Father and that He wants to speak and that He loves me. And it's just Abba. Abba. Maybe it's something like Teach me to listen. It's just a simple, short breath prayer. Teach me to listen. And that's your first prayer. You just stop and you center yourself and you get alone and you just ask God to speak. Help me. Let me rest in you. Teach me. Help me to quiet myself because I'm a loud person. Help me to still myself because I'm a busy person. Help me to trust you because I'm an anxious person. Teach me. Quiet me. Speak to me. And then you wait. And you listen. And at first it may seem like the only thing you hear are the crazy thoughts of your own head. And I know you've got some crazy thoughts. But over time, as you do this, as you seek this, as you pursue this, as you carve out time for this, you will get better. And God will, He will speak, and He will shape you, and He will mold you, and He will give you new power and direction for your life. And there will be new intimacy that's forged between you and Him, and a new desire to know Him, and a new ability to trust Him, to be led by Him. And you'll notice something, that when you go out into your world, you'll have less of a desire to speak and yell at people and constantly interrupt people and to be the center of attention, for everybody to know your name or think that you're so funny. You'll have a new peace, a new serenity. You will have a new and transformed heart if you commit to this way of praying, of peaceful, listening prayer. Can you do it? You want to try it? We're actually going to try it together. That's how we're going to close our time. We're going to try a little exercise. So while the worship guys get up and get ready, there's three questions, and we're not going to go through all these tonight, but there's 3 questions that you can kind of take to God. The first one is a very easy one. What or who do you want me to pray for? What or who do you want me to pray for? That's a pretty simple one. As you go to God and you sit before Him, instead of bringing your long laundry list of stuff, what if you just sat and listened? That's the question. You took that question tomorrow or Monday when you try this. What or who do you want me to pray for? That's an easier one. A harder one is this, and it kind of comes from this idea in Matthew 3 and 4. Especially if you're going through a change in life, especially if you got a crucial decision in front of you. Who am I? That is a big question to take to God, to listen to that. Who am I? Who do you say that I am? I know who I'm supposed to be. I know the role I'm supposed to play. I know who everyone else wants me to be. But God, who do you say that I am? I've been meditating on that for the past 3 months. God, who am I? Who do you say that I am? And the key phrase I've been taking is from that song that we sang earlier, from Be Thou My Vision. Thou my great Father, I thy true Son. I just kind of repeat that over. Thou my great Father, I thy true Son. Who am I? Who do you say that I am? If you spent 3 months praying that, asking God to speak to that, that would transform you. The last one is the one that we're going to do together. And it's a prayer of examine. And it comes from Psalm 139, 23 and 24. David prays this at the end of Psalm 139. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me and know my thoughts. See if there be any grievous way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. You're asking God, and this is scary. This is probably hardest of all. Out of those 3, this is probably the hardest of all, because you're asking God to ruthlessly search you. Search me and know me. Know my heart. Know my deepest intentions. Know my mind, what I think about on a day-to-day, minute-by-minute basis. Know my heart. Know my mind. See if there be any wicked or grievous way in me. Cleanse me. Lead me in your way, the way of purity, the way of righteousness. You're asking for God's scrutiny, for God's search. You're asking for God to examine you, to hold you up to the light. Now, that's scary because without this safety net of grace, without knowing that God, if you're in Christ, accepts you because of who Christ is, you would be undone. You would fall apart under the light of God's scrutiny. but he scrutinizes lovingly. So as we're going to try this prayer of examine together.